Hey everyone, I'm Kunal Bajwa.
And I'm Lance Jordan.
We are two nerds who decided to start a podcast in 2020 due to the pandemic. No topic is necessarily off the table, and we'd like you to join us in hearing our thoughts on various topics, ranging from anime to Zeppelins. We have it all. Here we go.
Drink water, they said. You'll be great, you said. It's like, great. They didn't tell you the amount of times you'd piss while drinking so much water. Damn it.
Yeah, hydrate or dihydrate though.
Yeah.
I know a guy who does like clear pee January, His goal is to just drink enough water so that his pee is always clear for the month of January.
Is it like the rest of the year just like jaundiced and like and horrible?
No, I mean, I think
make up for the rest of the year.
I think hydration is a priority for this gentleman. But I'm just saying, he challenges himself every January for that specific thing, to prove to himself that he can, I guess. But I think in general, hydration is a priority for this person.
I mean, it is for me as well, but I've heard of many different months, like No Shave November. I've also heard of, and this is not for the little kids. This podcast is never for little kids. It's for big kids that are adults now. Is like No Fap November, which of course we all know about that. And if you need a Google break, you can do it. In 1, 2, 3. Okay, cool. They already know what it is now. And yeah, that's how we're starting today's podcast, folks.
Well, if you want me to talk about that, I would just say that sounds like a way that you're going to tank your own testosterone. It does not. You get like an initial boost in testosterone, and then it'll tank. So,
I mean,
but hey, I'm not a doctor. That's just from the preliminary research I've done on that topic.
Right. I mean, like, you're not a medical biologist, but you are a biologist. And after all of this wonderful talk, let me introduce my guest today. It's my good friend, Chris Banatee. Thanks for coming on, man.
Of course. Happy to be here. We talked about this before. We tried a little bit before, but it just didn't work out. But, I'm always happy to hop on.
Yeah, like that was the goofy part. I don't think I even told Lance about this when he was still with me on the cast. But you and I did like a preliminary podcast during the pandemic, during like the early shutdown era. And I tried watching it and I'm like, oh God, this is super awkward on my side and everything, because I looked nervous as hell. I just deleted it because I was like, this is not something I want to hold on to. But it gave me the practice I needed. So thank you.
I think you got to build confidence in anything that you do, especially 100%. If you're new to it. I mean, I remember when we started our podcast on our side, and legit, we had the worst setup possible. We had the three of us like hosting, sitting on a bed or couch. In front of us was a piano bench with a microphone on it.
Okay.
And then we were only getting the audio from the TV that was on the other side. So like our guest would talk, the TV would play the sound, the mic would pick that up, and then we would talk on the other end of it.
So it'd be like a reverberation that oh my God, that sounds rough.
It sounded like we were in a fishbowl, but it was still, not a bad episode, I don't think. And we of course have like moved on a little bit from there with at least having, mics and headphones and things like that. So
everyone's first podcast is always the roughest. No, it definitely helped me get my confidence up for it, but I can self-assuredly say I'm a lot better now than I was then.
Yeah, everybody has to grow with everything that they're doing, So I can tell from your early shows to now that you've definitely improved. I mean, not that you were bad, but just from you settled into your groove,
Appreciate that. Thank you. So let me rewind clock back a little bit and talk about how the hell I know you in the first place. I was reconnecting with an old friend from grade school. Shout out to Stephen Ong. And he's like, hey, I'm going to be at the St. Louis Zoo and another friend there. And I was like, okay, cool. It's the summer of my junior year, so I was going to be a senior. And I pretty much met you in the most Chris Banatee atmosphere, I feel, in a lot of ways. Just in terms of nature and animals and biology in general. And I show up and I'm wearing, of course, Ninja Turtles t-shirt that I had to gifted donation because it was just starting to get faded and everything. But I have another one that's a different color, so we're all good. And I'm like, who is this kid? And we were like going around the place, and we knew one of the guys who's playing in the band.
Yes, I was gonna say, wasn't that it was Sam, right?
That was Sam. Yeah.
Steve's friend Sam was playing at a concert at the zoo.
There was that old lady that was always dancing there.
She is a character. That woman is at like every public event in the St. Louis area, and it's kind of scary.
Yeah, you speaking of people in the St. Louis area that are like, famous. There's this guy out in the Central West. I don't know if it's Central West End, but it's near like DeBoliver and Forest Park area, like the History Museum.
Mm-hmm.
And this dude, African American guy, super jacked, really long dreads, and he's like always running. And then I'll be like at a stoplight, and he'll just be like popping and locking. And, like he'll be like running and then stop and then just dance. And I've mentioned it to a couple of people, and they're like, "Oh yeah, I've totally seen him." Mm-hmm. And I gave him like thumbs up, and he was like, he waved out and everything. But I need to know this guy's name before I die or something. So
just next time you see him, be like, "Hey, what's your name?" Tony.
Oh boy. So I met you there, and then it was kind of like that moment in Step Brothers where you are talking to someone and hanging out with them because we got dinner, or like a light dinner afterwards, and it's like everything that I was into, you were into, or at least to some degree, like video games, anime. And that was basically it. That's really all you need to be my friend. So, what do you remember from that day? I've been talking a lot.
Well, yeah, I mean, we went to the zoo, and then we went to a place in South City for burgers, right?
That is correct.
And they were really good. I can't remember what the restaurant was called, but it was pretty good burgers.
I can see the restaurant in my head, but I don't remember the name.
I think that I'm a pretty easy person to get along with, and I think that you're a pretty easy person to get along with. So
yeah, I mean, even if you don't
got along,
even if you don't like anime and video games, I'm like, okay, I'll still like talk.
Yeah, we just kind of touched on some things like anime, video games, just kind of general nerdiness, just kind of general pop culture, movies and things. Yeah, and then I think after that we really started hanging out when you were doing improv. So
that's right. You ended up coming to a lot of my shows in my senior year, which is probably when I was at my best at that point. Yeah, when I was in college at least. So yeah, I remember one time I was like, "Oh, I invited you," and then I see you showing up in crutches, and I'm like, "What happened?" And you're like, "Oh, it's just an injury. I'll be back soon." And I'm like, "Okay, cool." So I want you to picture this super jacked dude with crutches coming and sitting in like the audience, and that looked uncomfortable. And I thank you for sitting in there in the hour long of the show, because I can't imagine that would have been comfortable, especially recovering from an injury at the same time. So it meant a lot.
Everything was uncomfortable in that time. When I tore my ACL, there was not a comfortable chair, ever. I remember I went to a concert, the Anne Boleyn farewell tour.
Ooh.
And it was in a small venue, I think it called the Ready Room or something like that, where there was no place to sit down, just like a stage and a room, which was like an awesome atmosphere. But there I was with my crutches and my fucking torn ACL. And then what's his name? Moon from Greek Fire and from like St. Louis radio personality was like, "All right, guys, I want you to think about how special this moment is." He's like, "I want everybody to just like sit down on the floor in silence and just think about how special this moment is." And I fucking couldn't sit down, standing there with my crutch, and I was like talking to everybody that was sitting there. It's like, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." But hey, it was what it was. It was
It was what it was. Didn't mean to bring back a sore memory, but that's like a vivid moment. I remember you walking around, and I'm like, "What happened?" And thank you for coming. Like came out of my mouth at the same time. So yeah, but yeah, it was wild. So yeah, then we kept on hanging out back in the improv days. You came to a couple more shows, and it meant a lot that you came. Did you ever catch the episode where we talked about the improv stuff? If you haven't, it's fine. There's no homework assignment. But
I think so. I mean, I'm gonna say with about 90% certainty that I did.
Okay.
but there's a chance that I didn't. I believe I did.
I think you did tell me. I was wondering if you remember when you were listening to it, did you remember anything that came up in your own brain?
I mean, not really.
Okay. It was like 10 years ago, so I get it.
Well, I mean, I have memories from the improv shows that were pretty good. I mean, I think they were generally impressive for what you would expect to get out of like a college improv group.
Thanks.
Not that I've gone to other like college improv groups, but I was impressed with that. But I do have one negative memory, and that was just that they asked for prompts for a scene.
Oh,
And they didn't want my prompt. I'm still a little bit angry about it. It was
which one was yours?
I said like throwing a virgin into a volcano. That would be a great prompt for an improv scene, and they didn't want it. So, hey, what am I doing? Just an underappreciated writer out here,
I think you told me about this.
Just another underappreciated writer out here, What could you do better than that? I don't think there is anything better than that.
I don't think you can. I think I would be salty about that too.
And they're like, we don't have a scene, we don't have a prompt. And it's like, oh, you do though. It's in the hat. Like it's in the hat. I wrote it on a piece of paper. You got it. They just didn't want to do it.
So. Oh my God. It reminds me of like there was a game called Lines, and I had to run the show one time, which was not a clusterfuck, but it definitely could have gone better. And I wrote a line on there that's like, I'll give you a dime if you lick my lime. And I was so happy that got put in there. And immediately, like the person who was in the game was like, Knall, fuck you. Yeah, they were a girl. I remember that very clearly. Like, sometimes I'll be driving and I'll be laughing to myself about that. So that's how happy I am about it. So like if that didn't get in, I would be just as sour.
Yeah. What is this like?
Pun intended. Like
8 years later, I still have this as a like still. If they ever have like a 2011 alumni reunion show, I'm gonna submit the same prompt. It wasn't 2011. It'd be like 2014, 2015.
Yeah, 2014 class 2015.
Yeah, if they ever do a reunion show, I'll come and I'll submit that same prompt. And if they don't take it, I'm gonna confront them. Like I've been waiting, 10 years for this. Yeah,
that's beautiful. We've been goofing off the past like 15 minutes. Let's dive into some stuff real quick. So you're a pretty cool guy because you are actually in grad school right now. And before we talk about like necessarily grad school in general, can you tell us what you're in grad school for?
Yeah, so I'm in a PhD program to get my PhD in zoology and physiology, but I'm more of kind of like a conservation-oriented ecologist, I guess you could say.
Okay.
Yeah, so my primary focus right now is looking at like elephant impact on woody vegetation and one tree species in particular, the marula tree, and then also looking at what influences the recruitment of this tree. So baby trees surviving to adulthood is a problem in this species, so we're trying to figure that out as well. That was just like a little bit of a primer. We can go into that more.
Sure, actually, yeah.
Forward, but
because the reason I asked you to introduce that and tell us what's going on is because in the early stages of our friendship, I was following you. I still follow you on Snapchat, but like when I was still on Snapchat, it would be like if you have ever seen the wild thornberries, it would just be like, oh, Chris posted something up today, and it would just be like he wouldn't show up. It would just be like him zooming into an animal and then doing the best impression for Nigel Thornberry. It's like, today we have, oh, darling, today we have like a birds in these nests. And he knew like the type of birds, he knew what they were doing, the whole background, the whole 9 yards on everything. So the reason I asked for the introduction of what you're doing now is like, I wanted to hear the story of how you got there. Your love of animals, your love of conservation, hunting, sustainability. If you dive into that however much you'd like to.
Yeah, I mean, so I've kind of always been like obsessed with animals. I probably would have been a better biologist as like a 6-year-old than I am now, just because I've been forced to learn so many dumb things and I've lost my like encyclopedic knowledge of animals. But yeah, I've always just kind of been obsessed with nature and animals. And I was the kid at baseball practice, like catching moths with my glove instead of paying attention. Because I mean, who even considers baseball a sport these days anyway?
Oh,
but
shots fired.
I'm just saying the moths out there were definitely more interesting. Or, when I would have to
go being a designated hitter, essentially.
Yeah. Or when I would have to wait, I have an older sister, so I'd go to her like sports games, and I'd be like trying to catch whatever animals I could. I almost caught a rabbit one time, like almost didn't catch it, but
okay.
Yeah, but then kind of watching like documentaries and going to the zoo and that kind of stuff, eventually you learn that there are certain like species that are like declining and due to decisions or like the impacts of people. So I was like, well, I'm watching Captain Planet as a child. It's like somebody's got to do something about
Thank you.
this.
Someone else saw Captain Planet when they were a kid. We had a whole episode. I brought up Captain Planet. Lance was like, that's the dumbest superhero ever.
No, man, I love Captain Planet. But yeah, it's like somebody's got to do something about this, Like, how is this a problem still persisting? And then I also had all kinds of pets growing up: fish, hamsters, gerbils, mice, guinea pig, all those kind of things, dogs. And so I've always had not just like an interest in animals, but a connection with a lot of animals. I tend to get along better with animals than I do people. So
thank you is what I got to say for letting me into that small circle. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, we can get on people momentarily, but yeah,
no doubt.
So just, when you finish high school, it's like, what are you going to do? Well, go to college. Then what do you like to do? Well, I think biology is interesting, animals are interesting. Then you go through the hellscape that is undergrad science in a medically oriented college or university. And then you finish that somehow and you're like, well, here's an opportunity to continue in biology. I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, and here's kind of like a little snippet of advice I'd give to anybody in terms of doing graduate school, but make sure it's like the right project for you. The last thing you want to do is end up in graduate school doing a project that you don't care about, right? But I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do when I finished my undergrad, and I was looking at master's positions, but I knew I had to pick like the right one. So I reached out to a friend, a researcher that I helped do their PhD research. And they're like, you should reach out to my best friend's old advisor. He gets to work in Africa. And I was like, oh, okay. Yeah, no, that sounds great. Let's see what opportunity is there.
And you just got back from there last week.
Yeah. So then I reached out and I found a master's program that would give me the opportunity to go to South Africa and do a research project there. And then now, sorry if this is a little bit long, but
no, go for it.
Been in school for 23 years, guys. Then I was struggling to find a PhD position, and my old advisor reached out to me with a text message one day. He's like, hey, Chris, I think your life's about to get better. Give me a call when you get a chance. And I did. And he's like, we've got funding for kind of the scaling up of your previous research for a PhD if you want to do that. So
I had no idea that story was that epic.
Yeah. It was very lucky.
Yeah.
But yeah, so now I'm like a third or fourth year PhD student. Who even knows? Is
time is relative.
Is time real?
No, it's really not.
Like I said, I guess the PhD technically would be in zoology and physiology, but I'm more of like a conservation-oriented ecologist.
That's the really sad part when you go higher up in education. You get so particular, your interests can no longer be widespread. And that's one of the reasons that I think finally turned me away from grad school amidst many other, but like one, I straight up just didn't want to do it. And I had to accept that. Two, like you can no longer have an appreciation for a lot of different things. You have to choose one and be fucking married to it.
Well, I'd say yes and no. Like during the process of a program, the goal is to like turn you into like an expert on either a method or a subject or subject and a method or those kind of things, so that you end up being like an expert on that. For example, when I did my master's research, I was doing like rodent feeding ecology. So I was trapping rodents and putting them through feeding trials to see which food they would prefer, that kind of thing. As anybody who goes through a program, you have a lack of confidence, you're frustrated, you're struggling, but then you realize like nobody on planet Earth has handled more of this species of mouse than I have, right? Not saying I know everything about it, but at the end of the day, probably nobody has handled more of Namakwa rock mouse individuals than I have, right? So,
and if they are, it's a small group of people.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like,
so, but then eventually, I think once you prove that you can be an expert on whatever, then it kind of opens back up again, should you so choose. But that's also kind of dependent on exactly what you pursued, and have you networked, have you made the appropriate connections and those kind of things. Yeah, so when you're going through a program, it really is funneling you directly, and you're going to be an expert on this thing for a long time and hopefully for life. But eventually, I think that funnel does open up at least a little bit. But I understand not wanting to go through that process also.
I mean, yeah, just like for me, I'm like kind of like a kid in a candy shop. I mean, hell, my entire podcast is based on like hobbies that people do. I don't think I've actually said what really I stand for on this podcast, but like, hobbies that are, we've lost our interest in hobbies in the last like 30-ish years. And the whole idea of being like a Renaissance person or someone who tries different things is not in the same way it was when I was here. I think like I was seeing a documentary on Leonard Nimoy, a guy who played Spock. His kids were saying like if there was something we needed to fix around the house, he would look up how to do it. And this is pre-YouTube, pre-internet, pre all these things. He was not afraid to just like mess around and see if he could do it on his own. And I really appreciated that. It's so sad when I see someone just go to work and come back home and do nothing. And I'm like, they have no side projects, no things they have for fun. It's the worst when I went to a party once, and I only liked one person, and he lived with two people that I just despised. But I came because I was like, it's a party, my friend will be there. And it was all it was the stereotype, not the entire picture, but the stereotype of people who are engineers that could only talk about work. And I'm like, what the fuck am I going to talk to you about? Because I am the furthest thing away from an engineer. Like there's nothing we have in common. And it was just a very awkward party. I ended up hanging out with just the only friend I cared about at that party. Which is also kind of funny because the other guys who I didn't like, I had met them like 10 times and they're like, this is, and I'm like, Kunal. He's like, it's the tip of my tongue. I'm like, dude, I've met you like 10 times. What the fuck, man? But yeah, you can tell I'm not sour about that still. So it's all good. But yeah, no, I love that for that reason, because we get to hear what people's interests are instead of just like what you're doing for money or whatnot, like,
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, I see the same thing. I mean, I am happy with the choices that I made in terms of pursuing like graduate degrees. However, that does come with its own set of challenges, right? Like you're never off work. There's always something you could or should be working on.
Yeah.
And it is nebulous about whether your time management is good or bad. There are ambiguous expectations and things. So I have found myself like, man, sometimes I wish I had like a 9-to-5 job or whatever. But then I'm like, well, there's also a good chance that I would just be exhausted at the end of the day. And being a graduate student actually does give you, sure, there's a lot of work and a lot of time, obviously, but it does give you freedom to pursue other things that you might not be able to do because it's all on your schedule eventually once you finish the classwork. So that's something I kind of like about that. I mean, if I wasn't a graduate student, I probably couldn't have gotten as far into like wildlife photography or hiking or camping or hunting or fishing. Not that I'm expert at any of those things,
but you enjoy them.
Yeah, right? I've enjoyed them, and I've been able to explore them because I have the freedom that comes with being a graduate student at that level.
So you kind of talked about conservation so far, but I'd really like to, because you talked to me about it and I found it really interesting. And I feel like in the way that you've described them, they are actually not too dissimilar, and they're actually very involved with each other, which is very odd. People don't think of it like that. So could you go into hunting in the way that you talked to me about it?
So I was always interested in hunting as a kid, but I had like conflicted ideas about it, because you're killing things and it's objectively kind of mean, right? But then you kind of learn more about conservation and specifically like the North American model of wildlife management. That's what operates in Canada and the United States. That's how we manage all of our species. And it's dependent on people participating in that system, right? So when you buy a hunting license, that money goes directly to conservation. When you buy a fishing license, that money goes directly to conservation.
Is it an annual fee?
Yeah, so you buy like an annual hunting license depending on where you are.
Gotcha.
And then those kind of things. That kind of got me really interested in it. I started exploring it more. I found like the meat eater guys, which are an epic group of guys that do like hunting and fishing and conservation media, whether that's their TV show or their podcast. But they also, on the podcast especially, will interview like wildlife biologists, and that also gave me like a lot of information. So definitely recommend those guys if you're interested.
Yeah, we'll put them in the show notes.
So in the North American model of wildlife management, like I said, it's really dependent on like participation. In some states, they don't have enough hunters, so that they don't have enough funding to do conservation work, basically. So I was always interested in it. And then also, like, as somebody who, I mean, quote unquote, is an athlete, I lift weights. Like
bro's jacked. Like, it's ridiculous. Like, I think it's always fun. Like, again, bringing up Snapchat, it's like squat day, and he just turns it up, and there's this like epic heavy metal that's just playing. See you doing the trap bar. Like, every time I've seen this guy, he's just built like a truck. So
well,
good for you.
You.
You're welcome.
I'm getting back in shape too. I have.
School is terrible for you, so don't even worry about it, man.
We'll talk about that.
Yeah, like for your I'm so glad I'm out of school, because like my back and knees and everything else, like I lost weight. I had to do a bunch of physical therapy. Like, it is bad for you, no matter how you slice it. Yeah.
Yeah, I always laugh. My parents always say like health should be your number one priority. And then I'm like, if health was my number one priority, I would have never gone to college. I would have just disappeared to the woods, like that's how that would have gone if health truly was my number one priority, because school is just horrible. It's like horribly toxic, extremely stressful. You sit for extended periods of time. It's just horrible for you. But, I guess it's technically good for your brain. But
sometimes
on the like intellect side, not the mental health side.
Yeah.
But yeah, like circling back. So because I work out, you have to meet a certain protein requirement if you're going to, do that. So it means you got to eat meat, unless you want to pursue like the kind of like vegan or vegetarian styles, which, hey, if that works for you, that works for you.
Right. Yeah.
It doesn't work for me.
Different goals, different body types. Like, certain people have different dietary restrictions for whatever elements cause. So yeah, no harm done.
But so then that means you got to eat a lot of meat. And in America, well, in the world over, kind of animal agriculture is not done in a sustainable way, especially in like the factory farmed kind of feedlot kind of way. So hunting and fishing opens up the opportunities to kind of harvest protein in a more sustainable way. Now, obviously, I'm not trying to pretend like I'm like a big hunter. I'm like into it more than I am. I'm dabbling at this point. I intend to get further and deeper into it.
The entire podcast title is "They Need a Hobby," so you're doing fine. Like, you're absolutely killing it right now. So go for it.
Yeah. So I guess started. I went squirrel hunting a couple times in Kentucky, unsuccessfully. I went deer hunting a couple times in Kentucky unsuccessfully when I was doing my master's, but it was really cool. I actually, this funny story where there's no limit on groundhogs in Kentucky.
Okay.
So I was like, I was hunting the property where my friend lived, and I was like, if I can't get a rabbit or a squirrel, I know there's a groundhog on this property because I see him. He lives right next to the driveway. Then I was like, well, then I'm kind of killing a character. I can't kill the character. So I just
like a mainstay of
Yeah. So then moving to Arizona, I actually met another graduate student in our lab who was like more into hunting. we had like a small group of guys that we would go jackrabbit hunting in the desert.
Right. And I remember talking to you when you were preparing that. Could you talk about that adventure?
Yeah, I mean, jackrabbits are like a very interesting animal in their own right.
They're huge.
And
I was surprised.
yeah, the first time we went jackrabbit hunting, we were in kind of some thicker brush, and I realized that there's an animal behind me, but I couldn't tell exactly what it was. I was like, "Oh, is that like a coyote?" It's like pretty decent sized. And then it ran away, and it was just it was a jackrabbit. It's like they're that big. Those antelope jackrabbits down in Arizona are pretty big. But yeah, so it's a great form of exercise. There was one day we went rabbit hunting, and I hiked 11 miles that day. So that was cool. And then,
Wow.
I mean, the meat tastes good. If anybody tells you jackrabbit doesn't taste good, they just don't know how to cook.
That's yeah. It's everything is all about how you cook it. Yeah.
Right. And in Arizona, they're kind of considered a pest species. So a lot of people shoot them and they don't like use the meat or anything. I was doing it specifically to get the meat, and so it's almost kind of like, I don't know how you describe it. I don't want to get it wrong, but it's very good. It's very good if you prepare it.
Okay.
Just get like a crock pot or an instant pot like I have,
Right.
and pressure cook it.
I just got an Instant Pot, and it's pretty amazing.
You can cook anything in those things.
Oh my
man.
God, you can cook cakes, you can cook jackrabbits, you can cook
Eggs, you can cook vegetables, you can cook soups. I just made some chicken soup in that the other day.
you can make good chili. Yeah, you can do anything in those. They're totally worth it.
We are not sponsored by the Instant Pot Corporation.
No, we're not. They don't listen to this podcast yet. With the hunting you're doing, it reminds me of a kind of a Native American or indigenous people aspect of, yes, you're killing the animal and you're taking that to deep consideration, because I remember learning as a kid, and unfortunately they would kind of sprinkle it with everybody and kind of mainstay like, oh yeah, all the tribes did this, and then that's a little unfair and everything. But as we've talked many times in this podcast before, like, history is a messy subject. Certain indigenous tribes would take, like, for example, the big example is buffalo. Kill a buffalo, and they would use every single part of the buffalo instead of just getting some of the meat and discarding the carcass. So like every single thing was, in a way, for lack of better terms, honored. And they also were intelligent in how they wouldn't do too much. They would know the right amount. And like you said, the jackrabbit, at least in Arizona, is a pestilent species, so it's getting out of control. It's causing other issues.
Well, I wouldn't say that it actually should be regarded as a pest, but I'm just saying, like, it's managed as if it were like a pest species,
which like is classified as such.
Yeah, like not managed at all. So, but yeah, I mean, we tried to tan some of the jackrabbit hides. I had a friend that was doing it, and just like we were just learning. So we had some success with that. I would like to learn how to do that more, like, going forward. I think respecting the animal should be like the number one thing. That's kind of my perspective on it. And I think that's something that was hard for me to like grapple with as a kid. The idea of hunting, you're killing the animal. How can you respect the animal? That kind of thing. Yeah. I think that's hard for a lot of people still to see that.
Could you unpack that a little bit, just in terms of how you got to respect it? Because I've always been interested about that.
Right. I mean, it's easy to think like, okay, you've got a gun, right? Like,
yeah, you're kind of winning at this point.
You're a bipedal ape who arrived on site driving 65 miles an hour and jumped out of a giant mechanical death machine, right?
Pretty much.
And then here you are with your explosion, boomstick.
Boomstick.
So you think, it can't be that hard, right? But some days you don't get anything. Some days, like, that animal is in its natural habitat. That animal is as sneaky as it possibly could be. That animal can run as fast as the biomechanics allow it to run. You know what I mean? So it's a challenge pretty much, like, no matter if you're hunting like an actual game species, it's a challenge no matter what you're doing. So that's part of it. But then also just kind of like seeing the habitat, seeing how the animal interacts with its habitat, learning more about what role that animal plays in the ecosystem. And it's a lot more valuable if you're perceiving it in person than just like learning about it or reading about it or watching a TV show or documentary or something.
Or going to Whole Foods and picking up like a prepared amount of it or something.
Right. Yeah. So also it's that kind of connection to like the food, right? Like I remember that I shot this jackrabbit in March in this piece of public land. And I remember that it was, a sunny day, not too hot. We hadn't seen anything that morning and then just got lucky right before we left or something. So you have those memories, you have that connection to the animal, and you had to work really hard for it. And to me, all those things go together to respecting it. And then you like produce food. Like hunting and fishing, I would say, are like a good gateway into cooking more.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Whereas, I like cooking beef as well. I like cooking in general, but it is a different kind of challenge and just more things to learn.
There's candied bacon every year at the summer at the West County
Saxony Clubhouse.
Saxony Clubhouse, that's what it was. Yep. Yeah.
Those parties were legendary, man. I hope to throw some more.
They still are. I would come mainly for seeing you and the candied bacon, no matter what.
Yeah, dude. I don't know why nobody really cooks candied bacon like that. I mean, it is just so good.
It's got two of the best things in the world, candy and bacon combined into one. And I don't get it.
Candied bacon, whiskey bacon, candied whiskey bacon.
I didn't know they had whiskey bacon.
Yeah, we would occasionally make that.
Oh, okay.
Take one of those cooking sheets, put your bacon in there, pour Jameson in there so it's nice and like coated in the Jameson. Let it sit for a while, and then when you cook it, the whiskey will burn off, but it does flavor it like a little bit. It's not like a super strong flavor. Okay. It's pretty good.
So this is all reminded me of my next point that I wanted to really get. In the past couple of years, we've been seeing, I don't know if you call it motivational, but like really interesting videos of reintroducing a population into an area to rehabilitate it. So specifically, like they've been throwing like wolves coming back to certain areas, and it causes the local habitat to, and I say heal in air quotes because I don't know if it's technically healing. A lot of it's a marketing video to get people to be more conservation and sustainable conscious. I was wondering, because you're talking about like respecting the animal, knowing what it's giving for you and what's role it plays as it's an environment. What are your thoughts on that? Because I feel like it's an oversimplification of what really should and does happen.
Absolutely. So like one thing to keep in mind is like all of our perceptions of ecosystems in North America are pretty much all warped, right? We only know what they looked like when Europeans came here, basically. We have very little information of like what the ecosystems looked like, historically. And so to say like an ecosystem is healthier or better or those kind of things, that's subjective. But I think it becomes more objective if you can say this species used to be here. Humans extirpated it. Now we put it back. I believe that is objectively a good change because a species, was here historically, and then it was removed by people for one reason or another.
Right.
And then you can say, okay, by our perception, with wolves, for example, like there's no wolves in the St. Louis area, right?
As far as I know. As far as I know.
There's no wolves in the St. Louis area, but you know what we have a shitload of? White-tailed deer, right?
Whoa. Oh, yeah, that's true. We do have a lot of deer, now that you mention it. Yeah.
Right. So, am I saying we should dump wolves into the St. Louis area? No, because that wouldn't be good for the wolves either. But I'm saying we can say that in an absence of predators, we have an overpopulation of prey species, which then has its own cascading effects, right? Like more collisions with deer can spread Lyme disease with ticks. They'll eat your plants, all those kind of things.
They eat my mom's roses all the time. She's still salty about that. They were beautiful flowers. Anyhow,
but like the legendary example of this is kind of the reintroduction to wolves to Yellowstone, forced the elk to change their behavior, which led like the willows regrow and all that kind of, which
That's the cascading effect that you're talking about.
shored up the river.
Mm-hmm.
And that is packaged perfectly as a product, and it is great, but it is absolutely more complicated than that. I'm not like an expert on this. I've just seen that more research has produced papers that say, okay, this equation is actually more complicated than originally
it has
thought,
to
which would happen with anything. However, it was probably still a great idea to put wolves back in Yellowstone. I mean,
okay.
Yeah,
I mean, like, it's a good way to get people, like, I think, in the door of realizing what the environment means and what sustainability really is, or conservation. And I know I'm using those terms interchangeably, but to the best of my knowledge.
Right. I mean, it's all a good term for that, as like shifting baselines, right?
Okay.
So when you grew up and you knew what winter was in St. Louis, and that is your perception of like how cold it gets, how much snow we get, when spring comes, when the birds come back, and that is like your perception.
Mm-hmm.
Now, with climate change, and as the city expands and more people, and the land use changes, and then if you were to have a kid, that kid's perception, 20 years later, 30 years later, would be 40 years later, whenever you have this child, that is their normal for winter. It's very different from what your normal would be, probably, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's like a shifting baseline of what is normal, or like how it should be. For example, with my research, the ecosystem I work at, they had removed all of the elephants, and I don't remember, it changes on exactly where you are in this ecosystem, but let's just say like for 70 years there were no elephants or whatever in this particular area. Then they put elephants back in, and they're like, oh man, they're messing up all the trees. They're killing so many of the trees, we're not going to have any trees left over. It's like, well, did you record what the trees looked like when there were elephants in this area?
Right.
Or are you just going off of what it looked like when there were no elephants in this area, and now you have elephants and now they're affecting the trees? So that baseline of how it quote unquote should be has changed over time, which is going to be an even bigger problem for people going forward with climate change, with just like more and more people on the planet, more and more people living in cities as opposed to like small towns or rural areas. It seems like we have a strong movement of people wanting to get like reconnected with nature or the earth, or like we do have a strong movement of people wanting to get outdoors more, and
or at least respecting it,
right, to more like rural areas. But at the same time, we also have tons and tons of people who are entirely detached from nature, right? So their perception of what is normal is strange.
The perception, I like your point on this. Like, perception is totally changes your point on when it comes to being sustainable, or what does that mean entirely. It's like climate change deniers are like, well, the earth's always been getting hotter, like we had snow over here 100 years ago. I'm like, yeah, that did happen, that is valid. And yes, climate change does happen throughout history, but not at this rate, not at this amount of craziness that's going on. Like, this is way beyond the threshold that we're talking about. People call me like a crazy optimist, but I do know that investing in more technology, and like you're saying, with the movement that's happening, we have the capability of it. I've heard one person talk about, like, in a lot of ways, plants will be saving because we can use them to carbon capture. We can use them to incorporate new technologies going forward. I don't know what they are, but I know we can. I've seen a lot of sci-fi where they and I don't know how true this is, but like a lot of sci-fi where they can incorporate literally their environment to better serve them. So like they make like I was watching the new season in Star Trek, and they actually have a ship that is powered by plants, literally. So they have their own like oxygen forming technology. Like, life support systems are so much different and easier. Instead of having it all powered by machines, they're like, no, we can synthesize a plant and use that to our advantage. And I think using imagination in that regard can help. But we have to, I mean, pun intended, I hate to hit a dead horse, but it's like we need to act quicker and quicker the more it goes on.
Yeah, I'm not like a with everything, this is just a casual conversation. So
Yeah,
if I'm ever wrong, any listener out there, just, disregard, go with the actual authority on the matter. But as somebody
yeah. We're just
who's
talking
like
here.
mildly educated on it, I'm not super optimistic about climate change and those things. I mean, I think
I know.
there's just so much money involved with the powers that be. Like, we could have had electric cars in 1901.
We ripped them out for either political reasons, but we also saw that gas was faster, but we had tracks laid and everything.
Mm-hmm.
It's ridiculous what we could have done. I've even heard friends who are physics majors in college say like Nikola Tesla was onto a bunch of things and died. It's essentially like induction stoves, but on a whole different level. And I would need a physics major to come and talk about that. But
Yeah,
yeah,
there's that. There's the fact that, like, General Motors was like, you're not going to have trains in this country. I'm sorry. Everybody's going to drive cars. And then our entire country is car dependent.
I mean, look at the gas
Um,
prices that we're having today,
mhm.
literally within the last like 2 weeks. I normally pay like 25 to 30 for a full tank. Now I'm paying almost twice as much.
Like, it is, I get it. Like, it's a very real problem, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's hard to tell somebody, okay, yeah, this affects your daily life.
Mhm.
Obviously, you can't say, hey, like, you're dumb for being upset about this, right? It is so politicized, it is so
Entrenched.
warped and entrenched and everything,
Yeah.
where it's like, we're gonna have to get away from fossil fuels if we want to
Oh,
persist as a
no,
species on this
I've
planet,
actually
right?
been looking at Teslas this entire week. I'm just like, how
Mm-hmm.
much can I make this work if I bought a Tesla? So
Right.
another factor I think that you're about to go into is like what material is the Tesla made out of? You
Yeah.
know, it's not like I had this great teacher who I wish you had met in a lot of ways. He was just an old school New York Jewish guy who was just so funny, so witty. Also ran his mouth a little too much sometimes and got himself into trouble. But he was like, it's not so much that we have electric cars; it's everything that we make those electrical cars with. It's not so much that you're plugging in your chargeable batteries into the wall; it's where that electricity is coming from. That's most likely powered by, with the dumbest air quotes, clean coal.
Right.
Um, it's not just switching something out, it's a huge undertaking of the entire system. And I think that's something that's especially lost on my parents' generation. Like when I told them, when I made a sale recently, and I was like, yeah, I'm going to keep this. My dad's like, why don't you throw it in a trust? That way you have it when you retire. I'm like, well, I want to buy an electric car. And he kind of looked at me weird. He's like, your car is fine. You have a great car right now. Why would you want to
Mm-hmm.
do that? And they just don't get it. It's like when I try to get them to use their cell phones in a proper way and they're just utterly lost. It's as opposed to the cell phones where they can just Google it and move on. This is like a whole lecture that I have to give them that they don't want to hear. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
So obviously, yeah, the how is the energy being generated for those cars absolutely is a problem. But then
yeah.
it's also like, okay, so we saw that the U.S. endorsed a coup in Bolivia to get to their lithium, right? And then they were like, they got rid of the person that we installed there, and then people were getting on Elon Musk because he endorsed it, and he was like, well, we can coup whoever we want,
I mean, we've been doing that since 1945. That's
Yes.
that's not that's nothing new. We've just kind of let it happen for so long.
Right, but
Yeah,
and
it's not
but
right.
so, for example, I mean, the rare earth metals in electronics and batteries has been a problem for a long time. Something
Mhm.
that kind of flew under the radar was like, we all know about like blood diamonds, but a
Yeah,
lot of those like rare earth metals were coming out of like Central Africa. They're dug up by like child soldiers and child slaves, and then they were
fuck.
in your cell phone. And then, it was like Nokia came out with like conflict free cell phones. And yet nobody in our country knew about that or cared about that really, where, because
I
we're
did not
so
know about that,
we're so
actually.
detached from the resource extraction that we have in other countries. On the one hand, that helps, the environmental regulations we have here help keep things nicer here. We do
Right.
still have problems. On the other hand, we're just pushing that somewhere else. Somebody else is going to have to deal with that. And then you could say, okay, that country's economy is better. They have a better relationship with America because they let us go mine there or something. But also, a giant mine is not good.
Yeah, it's horrible for it, and it actually reminds me of the Key and Peele sketch. I think you may have seen this. It's like there's a rebel force and they're trying to overthrow their dictators, and there's like an American correspondent is like, yeah, we really need your help, and we know that you're always there to help, like help us and get out, and we want to espouse American ideals. Like, yeah, I don't think we can really help you here. There's really nothing we can really do for you. And so they come back, and then he's like, what if we try this? And so he calls the American correspondent. He's like, we found a ton of oil.
Yeah.
And he's like, oh, you know what? We're here to like help you guys get freedom and everything. He's like, yes, 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 please come now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh man.
But that's just how human beings are.
Yeah.
I was talking about this with a colleague who is trained as an anthropologist, and we were just kind of riffing one night, and we're like, well, we're finding more and more hominid species that existed alongside Homo sapiens sapiens, right?
Yeah.
They're all gone, right? Like, it is no coincidence that they're all gone and we're here, and we are a violent, exploitative species.
Because we did that to survive, and just so ingrained into our brains at this point.
Right.
Quick question, like, I mean, obviously, I know some people have Neanderthal DNA, and so like I'm guessing one killed. Also, there was a definite amount of interbreeding that happened as well. Did he mention that as well? Did they mention?
Yeah. So we know that there's like genetic interchange between Homo sapiens and Neanderthal,
Denisovians, all that stuff, like a bunch of other players.
It's, I think, fair to assume some of it was consensual. I think it's fair to assume some of it, plenty of it wasn't. So
yeah, unfortunately.
But I mean, that's very interesting. But just kind of thinking like, what happened to those other hominid species? Like how?
Yeah.
How are we the ones that survived? Wow.
And also, it's like another thing of like they always talk about any other hominins or bipedal descendants of apes as like, oh yeah, they were idiots and they were savages. And then I've been hearing, like, I heard it all the time when I was a kid, and then as I've gotten older, like they're like, oh, that's complete bullshit. Like, they were actually very intelligent. Neanderthals were bigger, but they were not as dumb as we make them out to be.
Absolutely. Yeah. We're finding more and more art that they did. We're finding more and more that they had like funerary rituals and those kind of things. They had their own cultures as well, not just Homo sapiens. So I think that's pretty interesting.
I think one of the ways, me being the eternal optimist, which sometimes I wonder how we stayed friends for so long, but I think sometimes opposites really attract, is like the best way, like you have to accept whatever nature is there. And this is also part of the martial arts coming out of me. Like, you have to accept that nature there and understand it, and not just be like, oh, whatever, it's like this. I'm like, no, why are we like this? For me, it's when I hear what you're saying, it's like, okay, we did what we did, and I'm not denying it. Don't suppress it. Understand it, like why we did it. We did it for survival. The elements were scary. Animals were killing us. Like, there are other factors that play into it as well. My question that I'm leading into in all this rambling that I'm having right now is, if they wanted to learn things that are less marketed information on biology, early hominins, stuff like that, where do you go for that? Like, where do you go for Chris's like material to stay in touch with this stuff?
So I always recommend, and it's easy to say being still like a student, but
sure,
like the primary literature is always going to be like the most objective place to go. It's not necessarily going to be the most easy to digest, but if you can get your hands on like database or Sci-Hub, big Sci-Hub guy.
Sci-Hub, okay, yeah. PubMed, kind of like was one of the equivalents for med school students. Yeah.
Well, Sci-Hub is the free one, so they can like pirate all of these journal articles, and then they give them to you for free.
Oh shit.
So Sci-Hub I definitely recommend.
When you say pirate, do you mean like it's legal for them to do what they're doing? Or
I'm not endorsing any kind of criminal activity. Should someone not have access to a journal or a database, I think it would be fair that they might pursue other options.
I mean, they call it extra legal for a reason. It's so you can be more legal than when you started it. So I hear that.
Let me see. I know she's been the woman who runs it has been like embattled with legal, but she's not backing down. Let me see what the actual web address is. It looks like there's multiple iterations. The easiest one is sci-hub.se. So you could like Google Scholar search a topic, let's say like Neanderthals or whatever, and that'll come up with articles. And some of those articles you might be able to access just from that search. And Google Scholar is all like academic articles. You can choose if you want a book or academic articles, whatever. But then you get the article title from that search if you can't access it from that, and you go to Sci-Hub and you put it in there, or you get the DOI number, which is like the document identifier. Okay. You can put that in Sci-Hub and it should come up. So that's an option if you want like the true academic information.
What about a little more on the digestive side, possibly infotainment?
I don't know. I'm not like a huge anthropology guy. I just like know the things that I know from academic journal articles. But then also, I mean, like those Nat Geo documentaries from back in the day were still good. I think, back when they were still more kind of educational focused and those kind of things.
I mean, you could say this like similar things for the history documentaries, like they became like World War II and aliens real fast.
Well, I mean, there's nothing wrong with World War II documentaries, dude. But I used to watch History Channel, like 4 hours every day, and I knew a ton of historical stuff, way more than I know now, because I've been forced to learn dumb things and deal with dumb things. So my brain is dumber now. But I used to know a lot more about like dates, times, places of historical events and like who was involved. And
so Nat Geo is a big one for that, especially ones back in the early 2000s and 90s. Definitely, I'm sure today that they're still pretty good in their own regard. I know Bill and I had his show on Netflix that came back for a short time. I know Steve Irwin's kids are doing their own thing right now.
Yeah, I think talking about science communication is a good idea. I mean, I think with a lot of those what used to be educational channels, that's like the death of the American mind. As soon as History Channel had Duck Dynasty on it, or Swamp People, and it was like celebrated. And listen, hey man, if that's your life, I'm not trying to shame you, but I'm saying like
when it's the focus of everything is when it's the problem.
Yeah. So like
for me, I'm like, that's totally fine to have it, but like if it's the only thing we're seeing, like, that's when I'm like, okay, this is not cool.
That big shift came around like 2010, where it was just like very little educational material. It was also when we had like Jersey Shore, Keeping Up with the Kardashians, and that all like took over. So then it was like Animal Planet, not documentaries anymore. Now they got shows about like tree houses. Discovery Channel, they've got like shows about horrible exploitative mining practices in like the South American jungle. You got History Channel, it's like, okay, I think aliens are pretty interesting.
I'm a big supporter of like, well, not supporter, but like I'm like just the mathematical probability of aliens being there. Totally. I mean, but like, did they build everything for us? I don't think so. I think there are some things we can't explain that fit, but people run to that answer way too quickly. Like there are things that humans can be amazing and build, and mathematics is amazing. And every culture has had some form of math because that's how you advance and build shit. You just have really good math. They forget when invaders come in, everything gets destroyed. And so like then it gets supplanted by the incoming invaders, or they share notes, but typically it's just everything gets leveled and whatever happens. So like Discovery Channel, Nat Geo are good places that you recommend potentially to go.
Yeah, and also I mean like podcasts. If I'm not listening to a podcast or an audiobook, I will go insane. So I'm always listening to things.
Which reminds me, would you be happy to plug your podcast?
Sure, yeah. So I run the Bio Breakdown podcast. The point of the show is to kind of show that science is for everybody and that there's a path to get involved in science for everybody. You just have to find the right one for you. but we're also kind of more of a, I guess you could guess from the name, like biology, ecology, conservation oriented. So what we kind of do is interview scientists and say, how did you get interested in science? What path did you take to becoming a researcher? Let's talk about your research a little bit. What are you working on? What is the importance of this? And then what do you see yourself doing in the future? So right now we're on hiatus because I was just on a field season, but I do intend to kind of get the show back going.
Yeah, and besides, you have like, even if they aren't caught up with it, they have a ton of backlog now, so they're good.
Yeah, I think we've got at least like 20 episodes, maybe.
That's what I thought when I checked it out. Sure. It's fun to see you as the host. It's fun to see you the host. Like there's definitely a spring in your step when I hear you talk.
I enjoy it a lot, and so far I've been, interviewing friends and colleagues that I know on a personal level. So it's also an excuse for me to catch up with people. But I do intend to like grow it out and speak with other scientists that I don't know and those kind of things. But yeah, I mean, science communication, it's lacking in like popular media. Not that Captain Planet is technically science communication, but it's like it gets people interested in science. It
ignites the fire within children to be like, oh, okay, this is kind of cool,
Bill Nye as a kid. I used to watch Bill Nye. I used to watch Crocodile Hunter, Jeff Corwin, O'Shea's Big Adventure. I was way into all those animal shows, plus just all the like anonymous nature documentaries that were on TV back in the day. And nowadays, I just don't think it's there the same way. And as far as like science communication goes, I'm trying to get better at it myself, but it's becoming more and more clear that unless you can talk to like a non-expert, unless you can kind of discuss your research in a coherent way with somebody who's not a scientist, then you're missing out on so much value, right? Because especially with like conservation, the common person has to care, not like common, but just mean like the everyman, every woman, it will affect their lives.
Yeah.
At some level.
And that's why I had you on this podcast, because I was like, I need my resident expert to come in my world, to come in and say some things that I don't know and don't understand, because it's important. Before we wrap up, I definitely need to ask, what are you watching these days, anime-wise, comic books, video games, etc., etc.?
I've kind of fallen behind on anime a little bit. I will say that. I really want to go back and rewatch Zoids.
Zoids. We've geeked about so many times about Zoids, but every time it's just, I'm so glad someone else saw that show, because I thought I was the only one.
Well, and I listened to Wizard and the Bruiser, right? They have an episode on Zoids, it's pretty good, but they're like, I didn't watch it that much, and I'm like, dude, I was obsessed with that show as a child.
I love, and you actually turned me on to the Wizard and the Bruiser. They're on Spotify exclusively. They're great. They're two goofy guys that do run a podcast about nerdy stuff. The only downfall I find about it, and I feel like they know this, but like whenever they don't like something or know a whole lot about that, even if they research, like it's really hard to listen to the episode. Because they did like Power Rangers, and I was a decent fan. I wasn't like a ginormous fan, but I watched a lot of it. And like within the first like 5 minutes, they were just like, we hate this shit. And I'm like, all right, I was gonna delete this episode because it's not fucking worth it. Yeah, but Zoids was dope, man. They were like Gundams, but like animal form, and awesome. The Liger units and everything.
Yeah, I mean. Man. But there was also like so much diversity, and you could build the models. I was way into the models as a kid.
I'm into the Gundam models right now, actually.
Yeah, I wish I could. If I win the lottery and I can afford a home, I would like to have like a bookshelf that I could put my Zoids models on and add on to it.
You still got them?
Buy some more. Yeah, they're back home at my parents'. That is something they're not allowed to like throw away.
Yeah, seriously.
But as far as things I'm watching, right now I'm going back and rewatching BoJack Horseman.
Ooh.
I love that's one of my all-time favorite shows.
It's on this last season, I think, right now, or it ended.
Well, yes, yeah, they're finished because
Yeah.
the whole corporate, Netflix didn't want to pay them more, so they were like, "You're just gonna be done after this season." Um, I don't want to get too far into that, but the new Viking series has come out, so I started watching that.
I still haven't seen that. I still need to. I mean, you keep on telling me that it's a really good show.
Like the original
Yeah.
Vikings, not every season is as good as all of them, but as a package,
Okay.
it's tremendous.
Yeah.
Like the first season's fantastic. The second one is like maybe not as good, but still very good.
Okay.
I think the third one might not be that great, but then it kind of goes up and down, from that. And the way they tie up the loose ends at the end of the series is excellent. So I started the new one. I'm waiting for Peaky Blinders new season. I think it's also their final season to be put on Netflix.
I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
And that is one of my all-time favorite shows. I've heard from a lot of people they struggle to get into it because of there's so much setting the scene early on and establishing who the characters are and what their relationships are, which is that's a valid complaint.
Yeah.
But I'll promise you it's worth it. Like if you can get through that, I promise you it's worth it.
I was listening to a podcast that was talking about there's a show called Warrior, which is basically what Bruce Lee wanted to do back in the 70s, but Hollywood didn't have it's still pretty racist now, to do it. And so that they made Kung Fu instead. So like they made this show called Warrior, which is starring Andrew Koji, who's been in some other stuff, and they compare it to Peaky Blinders consistently in this podcast. And I've seen some clips of Peaky Blinders, and it actually does remind me of that because it's set in the same time, set in the 1800s. It's just Asian gangs versus the San Francisco police, and whereas like Peaky Blinders is Irish gangs versus the British, I believe.
Well, yeah, they're British, so
Yeah,
but yeah, so it's pretty much all British.
all British. Okay,
But there are plenty of events. I don't want to spoil anything. Eventually,
Spoilers.
The Irish do get involved.
I mean that's just gonna happen.
The Russians, yeah, of course.
Yeah,
I'll have to check out Warrior. That sounds really good. And then
yeah, it's on HBO Max.
okay, I'll have to see if I can find that somewhere. I wish Sci-Hub for television. And then a show that just absolutely blew me away that I've loved was Yellowstone. I watched Yellowstone.
Oh yeah, I've been hearing about that. There's been some heavy hitters that have come on that show. I know that.
It's like a modern Western, but I would also compare it to like Peaky Blinders in terms of like the whole anti-hero perspective, which I'm a sucker for.
That's your jam right there. I mean, like one of the reasons we became friends was our love of Dragon Ball Z, and I remember posting something, and you're like, "Well, Vegeta is the best." That's just the answer for it all. And I've come to see that a lot more. Like when I was a kid and older, even as being an eternal optimist. Or a realistic optimist, in my opinion. He has way more character development and depth than a fucking terrible father like Kakarot. So yeah, I 100% agree with you.
Well, I love villains that are well written so you can understand why they are the way they are.
Yeah.
I think that is something that is too scarce in popular media, where oftentimes it's like, this is the bad guy because we said he's the bad guy, and you don't really know, like, for example, Vegeta, he has a dark past. He's traumatized.
He grew up the way he did.
Tough relationship with his father, so of course then he has to become the prince. He has to own the name. He has to become, the new king. He has to vanquish the oppressor of his people.
Right.
While he's being forced to oppress others.
And from a child, he's just been taught to murder people. So he doesn't know any better.
And there's just so much complexity there, which I appreciate, or like, so I kind of consider him, he does become part of the like protagonist crew, but I consider him just like a well-written villain at that level. But then anti-heroes, like a flawed protagonist, I hate Superman. Superman is the dumbest thing. He can't ever lose. He's
Our Captain America. Yeah.
Well, yeah, he's a good guy because he's a good guy. He was born good, and he's good, and he can't lose. So
You would really like the Injustice storyline, I feel sometimes.
mhm.
You should check it out. But yeah, just like the environment and everything else that we love, if it doesn't have any complexity, is it really worth living in?
Mhm.
So
Yeah, I don't know. I just like those like complex characters, give me some grit that I can dive into and get my hands dirty, like learning about this character and like why they do what they do.
yeah.
I don't have much time for like simple characters.
No, I hear you. Great way to wrap up today's episode because that's exactly how you take care of stuff when you're researching. And if you
Mhm.
just have something like, oh, this is just a mouse, it mouses around the place and cats eat it. We're done.
Yeah.
It's just kind of a boring sentiment. It's like, oh no, this is only born in this kind of climate and can survive here, and this does these things to the environment. That's more of an accurate picture of life. So, yeah.
Mhm.
But on that note, thank you for coming on.
For sure. And I'm, always happy to come on. So
Yeah.
sure we'll have, maybe some more conversations in the future.
Oh, definitely.
But it was a great time. And
Good.
I hope people enjoyed things that I said. That's what I live for, is that somewhere out there, somebody might appreciate what I have to say. So
I mean, if nothing else, they got hydrated from this episode. So I'm down for that.
hydrate or dihydrate, baby.
And on that, we're going to call it right there. Can't come back from that.
Hey fan peeps, thanks for joining, and as always, we appreciate any feedback. You can follow us on our Facebook page, They Need a Hobby, and also at TNAH Pod on Instagram and Twitter.
Hopefully one day we'll find a hobby and maybe even be one of the cool kids. Peace.
Ezekiel. His name has to be Ezekiel for sure.
He's so excited about the Bible, he's dancing, essentially. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, man.